Welcome to the Happy Bones, Happy Life podcast. I'm Margie Bissinger, a physical therapist and integrative health coach, and I am your host and guide on our journey to discover the keys to stronger bones, more happiness, and the secrets to live your best life ever. From nutrition to stress, from exercise to happiness, you will gain revolutionary insights from our leading experts. It is time for you to discover the health and happiness you deserve. Hey, Margie here. Wow, this is an interview you don't want to miss because we're talking about glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in the weed killer Roundup that is sprayed on so many of our crops. But yet many of us have no idea that there can be negative health effects on our bones and overall health. And this is the topic we're delving into with our very special guest, Dr. Stephanie Seneff. And Dr. Seneff is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She has a Bachelor of Science degree from MIT in biology and a Ph.D. from MIT in electrical engineering and computer science. Her recent interests have focused on the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and disease, with a special emphasis on the pervasive herbicide Roundup and the mineral sulfur. She has authored over 30 peer-reviewed journals over the past few years on these topics. And in today's interview, we talk about the negative health effects of glyphosate and how it can impact our joints, our bones, our gut, and so much more. We also go over what can we do to reduce glyphosate and detox from it. So it's a very powerful interview, so stay tuned. Welcome, Dr. Seneff. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here. I've been a big fan of yours for many years and reading your research and what you do, and it's just so incredible the work you've done to make such a difference in the world. So I'm just beyond thrilled to share this information with this audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think we're just going to delve right in because we have so much information to cover. But let's start really, really simple. And just because a lot of people, they may have heard the word glyphosate, but they really don't know what we're dealing with. So why don't we start with the basics and just what is glyphosate and why is this such a concern for our health?
Glyphosate is the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, which I imagine most people are familiar with. As you can go down and get some Roundup and use it to kill the dandelions in your yard. It's considered to be completely non-toxic, practically completely non-toxic to humans, and therefore it's a fantastic herbicide. It kills all plants except for those that have been engineered to resist it. And so it's been a great boon in growing crops because they can create these crops through genetic engineering, GMO technology. They create these crops that are resistant, and they can just spray glyphosate all over the crop and it doesn't die. So very, very efficient farming comes out of that, where you can just control the weeds by just spraying the crop with poison. The poison gets taken up by the crop and gets into the food supply. So we basically have glyphosate all over our food supply. The government doesn't care because it's completely safe to humans. So as long as you believe it's safe, well then fine, it's great, there's no problem. But the problem is that it's not safe. And I am very confident at this point in saying that glyphosate is the primary reason for an epidemic that we're seeing in a long list of neurological, autoimmune, metabolic, oncological diseases. They're all being increased in prevalence as a consequence of chronic exposure to glyphosate in our food. I feel very confident in saying that.
So back in, I guess it was the late 1990s when they did the GMOs. Do you want to just say what they exactly, like how did they do this and what crops does this affect?
Yes, so the idea was, well, they found out that there was this critical enzyme called EPSP synthase, which is in a biological pathway called the shikimate pathway, which is present in most plants and also in many microbes, but which does not exist in human cells. And so they were delighted by that because they figured it can't affect our cells if we don't have that pathway. We don't have that enzyme, we don't have that pathway, we're good, right? That's the argument. Now, a flaw in the argument is that our gut microbes not only have that pathway, but they use it to produce essential amino acids for us, the aromatic amino acids, which we can't make because we don't have that pathway. So we depend upon both our food sources and our gut microbes to supply those critical nutrients. So when that pathway gets killed in our gut, we become deficient, and that has enormous consequences because those aromatic amino acids, for example, are precursors to the neurotransmitters, melatonin, serotonin, melanin, the skin tanning agent, thyroid hormone, various B vitamins. All of these things come out of the shikimate pathway. So when the microbes are destroyed in their ability to produce those aromatic amino acids, we become deficient in all of these absolutely essential nutrients. And that causes all kinds of diseases. So that's a starting point. And there's much more, but that's a good place to start.
Wow. Well, a couple things. I mean, that's unbelievable. Our melatonin, our sleep, our serotonin, our sleep.
That's
And
right.
we know that sleep affects every possible organ in our bones.
Yes. And so you asked me to mention the foods. And so the ones that have been GMO engineered are soy, corn, sugar beets, canola. So you've got the oil, the sugar, the corn, and the soy, that all of those basic foods go into the processed food industry. So all these processed foods come out of those crops. There's massive, we just produce huge amounts of these crops just to fuel the processed food industry, which means that the processed foods tend to have high levels of glyphosate. Now, the other thing I didn't say is that glyphosate has also been discovered to be very useful as a desiccant at the end of the crop's life. So right before harvest, they're spraying glyphosate on several other crops in order to kill the crop. So they intend to kill the crop. They want to make it go to seed. It increases the yield. It synchronizes the yield so that you can harvest the seed all at once across the field, because everything goes to seed as soon as it gets poisoned by this glyphosate. The glyphosate goes up into the seed, and so you end up with high levels of glyphosate. The highest levels that have been found in foods have been found in the ones that are not GMO. So when you see non-GMO, you think you're safe. That's not true. Those crops can have even higher levels of glyphosate because it's right before harvest. It goes into the seed, and we're seeing extremely high levels in things like oatmeal and Cheerios, which are very common food for children. So oat-based cookies, also wheat, so bread. That's why we have an epidemic in gluten intolerance, I believe, is because of glyphosate in the wheat. Also beans like chickpeas and garbanzo beans and lentils. So you have like hummus, for example, which is considered to be a very healthy food. And lots of times when people are gluten intolerant, they start eating a lot more beans, they're getting more glyphosate in the beans as well. So you're getting poisoned whether you're avoiding wheat or not. It's not, it's the glyphosate you need to worry about, not the wheat.
That's so interesting because, as you said, we do have an epidemic with gluten. The interesting thing is, though, that if these same crops, if they're organic, they're not being sprayed with glyphosate.
Right.
Is that correct?
They cannot use it in organic crops, which is a super, super good thing because we buy exclusively certified organic when we shop at the grocery store, my family. And we've gotten our kids to do it for the most part as well. So I'm very happy about that. And I think it's essential. Really, a key take-home message is just when you shop at the grocery store, look for the certified organic label. That will help to reduce your glyphosate exposure by a lot. It doesn't totally eliminate it in all cases. So some of the organic foods even end up with glyphosate in them. It's not because they're using it. I mean, unless they're being dishonest, but it's probably because it's in the rain. I mean, it's going to come in from the neighbor's farm. I mean, you really can't keep glyphosate out because it's so pervasive. It's the most used herbicide by far on the planet. And the US was a leader. So we used more of it early on compared to other countries. And we also have an enormous health crisis right now in this country. We're struggling with how to pay for the insurance for all the health issues that we have. When you look at the statistics, it's just horrific. When you look at Alzheimer's and autism, ADHD, and all these gut problems, they're all going up dramatically, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. Really, really good correlations.
It's unbelievable. And it's just amazing that you can go to the store and buy Roundup, no big deal. It doesn't have any signs on it. This is destroying the health of America. It doesn't.
Yeah, huge stacks of it you see in some cases. It's just horrible.
And the average person really doesn't know. That's the sad thing. But the good takeaway, so number one takeaway for everybody, if there's any other reason, I mean, there's so many reasons to buy organic, but this is a huge reason. And, in life, we can only do what we can do. So obviously not everything in the world, you're going to be in situations, but whenever you can, by buying organic, it's going to significantly reduce the glyphosate. So that's so very, very important. So let's talk about the gut, because there's a huge relationship with osteoporosis, our bones, and problems with the gut, whether we're not absorbing, whether people have Crohn's, colitis, there's so many issues, but there is a very big correlation when people have issues with their gut and osteoporosis. So why don't you sort of tell us exactly what glyphosate is doing and how it's causing problems in our gut?
Yeah, multiple ways, and I've been studying that quite a bit over the past several years. So I know a lot, and it starts off with disrupting the gut microbes. So it actually kills microbes, as you might imagine, since they critically have that shikimate pathway. But it preferentially
Wait,
kills the
stop for one
beneficial.
minute. What is, can you just explain the shikimate pathway?
Yeah, that's the pathway with the EPSP synthase enzyme, which glyphosate famously disrupts, which it gets blocked. So if that enzyme gets blocked, then the pathway gets blocked. And that's a biological pathway that produces those aromatic amino acids that are precursors to the neurotransmitters and all those other things. So
Okay, so all those things you talked about before, this pathway is really important, and that's disrupted by the glyphosate. Okay,
right.
great.
And then it ends up killing the beneficial bacteria preferentially. It's been shown that bifidobacteria and lactobacillus are especially sensitive to glyphosate, whereas pathogens like Clostridia are more robust. And even, for example, microbes in general get killed, and that allows yeast overgrowth. So you end up with issues with excess, yeast problems, yeast infection, and Clostridia produce toxins that can disrupt your brain. I mean, there's various problems with these pathogens, but also you get the immune system responds to these pathogens to try to keep them in tow, and that it results in inflammation, and then the gut lining gets destroyed. It's been shown that glyphosate suppresses increases the expression of an enzyme called zonulin, which opens up the gut barrier. So you end up with a leaky gut situation when you're chronically exposed to glyphosate, your gut becomes leaky. And that allows all these, for example, autoimmune disease becomes very prevalent because it also disrupts the ability to digest the proteins, because lactobacillus, for example, has several enzymes that are crucial for breaking down gluten. So when you eat the wheat with the glyphosate, the lactobacillus is killed. The gluten doesn't get adequately broken down. And then you open up the gut barrier, and the gluten peptides go into the circulation, and that causes an autoimmune attack on your tissues through something called molecular mimicry. So it's a little bit complicated science, but it ends up with gluten causing a whole bunch of symptoms that are a consequence of the killing of the lactobacillus by the glyphosate, which is impairing the ability to digest the gluten, and then opening up the gut barrier to let the gluten get out into the general circulation and cause an immune reaction.
You know, that's an area that's near and dear to my heart. And I actually had my husband as a guest on the podcast because that's exactly what happened to him. Not through glyphosate. This was through massive antibiotics. But, where the zonulin, we had leaky gut.
Exactly.
And then he had a virus before it, but then the gluten gets in, the body can look like virus, then the body attacks. And the interesting thing is what you're saying, it can happen to your weakest organ. So for him, it was a terrible cough, losing massive weight, sweats. So it doesn't have to be GI. It can be, right, any system in the whole body can be affected. So it's something that is very serious. And as you mentioned, there's such a rise in autoimmune. So that's interesting.
And of course, autoimmune also leads to the bone problems. You get autoimmune rheumatoid arthritis and things like that as a consequence of various proteins. It's so interesting how these foreign proteins cause the immune system to respond. And then through this molecular mimicry process, if there's too much response, these antibodies become antibodies to your own tissues, because you have proteins that have sequences that resemble the sequence that your immune cells got upset with because it leaked out of the gut. So you get all kinds of different autoimmune diseases are connected to this issue of over enthusiastic immune response to peptides that didn't get digested.
And how sad is that it could be caused by glyphosate? I mean, people are struggling with these issues. It's just unbelievable. But it's amazing that you brought this to our attention and have done so much research on this. And you have I'm sorry.
Glyphosate is an antimicrobial agent. It's been patented as an antimicrobial agent. So it's essentially an antibiotic. And I think it's actually causing the multiple antibiotic resistance problem that we're seeing, where people are getting runaway infections that they can't cure. They throw the kitchen sink at it, doesn't die. Pseudomonas and things like that. MRSA, multiple resistant Staph aureus, all these infections that people are dying from. Because the antibiotics aren't working. And there's this paper that showed that exposure to glyphosate can cause certain microbes to develop these pumps that allow them to pump out glyphosate, but also allow them to pump out the other antibiotics as well. So they become empowered to be resistant to multiple antibiotics as a consequence of their training with exposure to glyphosate.
Oh, that's just unbelievable. And that is a problem today. We're having resistant organisms. Wow. Now you have a plausible mechanism by which glyphosate can pose an insidious threat to our health. Can you just go over this mechanism and just explain why it is such a threat?
Yes, this is a mechanism. Actually, Anthony Sample and I started studying glyphosate probably 7 years ago. I got really into glyphosate, started reading everything I could about it. Took us 2 years of studying glyphosate before we came to the realization that it could be doing this. And we sort of put it out as a hypothesis to each other. And he proposed it to me, and I was at first skeptical. And then, but I got interested because he was insisting. And so I decided to look harder. And then once I looked, I thought, oh my God, this is it. I mean, it was really an epiphany for me. And it was amazing what we found. And I'm absolutely convinced at this point that I'm right. I want to say that I'm getting enormous pushback. Like almost nobody thinks it's possible. So we're in a situation where what I see is happening, which can explain all these correlations with all these diseases, is something that most chemists are saying is not possible. So just keep that in mind. It's a battle going on right now between basically me and the rest of the chemistry world, but I'm standing up for my rights because I see the evidence is so overwhelming, and it explains. You see all these correlations, and people say, oh, correlation doesn't mean causation. They dismiss it, you know? But
Well,
the fact
fill
is
us in. Tell us what this is.
all these things are going up, and the glyphosate is the thing you look at because it's going up too. And so that was what was causing me. What is it about this molecule that makes it so toxic? So the thing is, glyphosate is a glycine analog. We knew that. It's a complete glycine molecule. Glycine is an amino acid. It's the smallest coding amino acid. And the amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So when we make proteins, our bodies live for proteins. I mean, they produce all these proteins, they do all these things, that they're really the workhorses of the body. And they are the DNA code. So when you talk about DNA genetics, you're talking about the DNA code that codes for specific sequences of amino acids that are assembled like paper dolls holding hands or like beads on a string. They're just a long line of these amino acids hooked together. And glycine is one of them, maybe one of the most important ones, because of its lack of any side chains. It's very tiny, and therefore it's often critical in certain places in proteins. It absolutely has to be glycine. So you can go find on the research literature all these cases of proteins where a particular glycine is always there, and if you change it to something else, you get severe disease. So you know that glycine has to be really important. Then you can look at that disease and see whether it's going up exactly in step with glyphosate. You say, okay, sure, of course, glyphosate is causing that glycine to not be glycine anymore because it's going in and replacing the glycine with glyphosate. Glyphosate is exactly a glycine molecule. It also doesn't have any side chains, but it has extra stuff stuck onto its nitrogen atom. And the nitrogen atom, these extra things on the nitrogen atom is what makes all the difference in its behavior, because it's got this what's called a methylphosphonate. It's a little bit of science here, but a methylphosphonate attached to the nitrogen, which takes up space and has negative charge and makes it more water soluble. So it changes the characteristic of the protein when there's glyphosate there instead of glycine. But it's basically fooling the machinery that's assembling the protein because it looks exactly like glycine. It fits into the pocket. It's like the nitrogen has to be outside of the pocket because it has to hook up with paper dolls. So it's like you're sticking your hand out, but then your body is very perfectly shaped for the pocket, and no other amino acid will fit because you're the smallest amino acid. You make that thing very tight. Glyphosate fits fine because it has exactly the same profile as glycine. It's exactly the same thing. It just has this extra stuff hanging out of the socket that hooks up with the paper dolls. So you see what I mean? It works perfectly for glyphosate to substitute for glycine. And especially in certain cases where there's room for that extra stuff. And those cases happen to be very, very important. One of them is this enzyme, EPSP synthase. It has a place where it binds to something called PEP. PEP has a phosphate, and the protein has an absolutely conserved glycine residue at the place where that phosphate binds. If you put something else there instead of glycine, you disrupt the ability of phosphate to fit because you take up extra room. So when glyphosate substitutes for glycine, it occupies, the methylphosphonate of glyphosate occupies the spot where the phosphate should go. And now PEP doesn't fit anymore. The enzyme is dead in the water.
Wow. So let's go to the next step. Okay. So now we're replacing glycine, and then, we're changing the structure. So what are the consequences of just that?
Well, they're huge. I mean, they're absolutely huge. And I'm still finding every day new proteins that will be affected. It makes an incredibly elegant story to explain why glyphosate would be causing all of these diseases. So I've got a long and growing list of proteins that I believe are being disrupted by glyphosate and
but what would they
causing disease.
So what diseases, just in a nutshell, what people are listening and they're like, oh, we're listening to this story and we're thinking, okay, so now we're not getting the glycine, we're disrupting and the pathway that needs the glycine. And so what would be the end result with what diseases in particular, or what structures, or have you found?
Right. Well, I'll give you several examples because it's such a huge topic that I've written a whole book on it, which is under review right now with the
Oh,
publisher.
fabulous. Wow.
It's really, really, really interesting. And so, for example, Alzheimer's, there's the amyloid beta, which is the plaque that is associated with Alzheimer's. That's got critical glycines. They've shown that when those glycines are substituted, it causes the protein to misfold. So that explains Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is going up exactly in step with glyphosate. You have myosin in the gut. So myosin is a contractile protein, several highly conserved glycine residues. One in particular that's been shown, if you substitute alanine, which is a very small change, the protein can only contract at 1% capacity. So it ruins the ability of myosin to contract. That's going to mess up peristalsis in the gut. It's been shown a woman who tried to kill herself with glyphosate, her gut became paralyzed. So they've shown experimentally that it causes paralysis of the gut, and that makes sense because it's disrupting myosin. And that's going to also affect the gallbladder. So the gallbladder can't release bile because it gets frozen by glyphosate exposure. And I believe that, so bile acids are a big problem, and that's actually very interesting for many reasons. But so the ability to produce enough bile acids is problematic with glyphosate. It disrupts the enzyme in the liver called the cytochrome P450 class of enzymes in the liver called CYP enzymes, which are incredibly important for many things. They activate vitamin D, so you get vitamin D deficiency. They produce the bile acids. They detoxify a number of different toxic chemicals. So when those are broken, lots of bad things happen. And we're seeing all of those bad things in our society. So without sufficient bile acids, one thing really interesting that I only learned recently about the bile is that bile acids are essential for the synthesis of a molecule in human biology, a hormone, which is called andamide. I think it's called, is it andamide? Anandamide, which is actually an endogenous protein that works just like the marijuana. Yeah,
really?
it's like an endogenous form of marijuana. Anandamide, very, very interesting. You can look that up. And I suspect that anandamide depends not only on the production of bile acids, but also on the modification of the bile acids by the gut microbes. So the gut microbes that modify the bile acids get disrupted by glyphosate. And the production of the bile acids gets disrupted because of the CYP enzymes. And the release of the bile acids gets disrupted because of myosin poisoning in the gallbladder. So you end up with a deficiency in anandamide, and that may be why that gives you a lot more sensitivity to pain. So when you have various kinds of issues with arthritis and whatnot, and if marijuana, is helping you to heal, that's probably because it's providing you with an exogenous form of this endogenous hormone that you can't make.
That we normally would have. Wow. So a couple things I just want to touch on. So for those who don't know what peristalsis is, that's the movement so that food goes down. And so many people have an issue with immobility and SIBO and different things. That's all connected. So that's very interesting that could be related to the glyphosate. And vitamin D. I mean, in this community of bone health, oh my gosh, vitamin D is absolutely critical. And so many people are low in vitamin D for numerous reasons, but that's interesting that can even be another reason that people are taking a lot of vitamin D and they're still low in vitamin D. Wow, very, very interesting. So that's great. We'll have to exciting when your book's going to come out, and hopefully it will really turn people. It'll really make a big difference because you've done so much research, and obviously it's disrupting pathways that can really affect the body. So good for you. That's very exciting. So now let's talk about the bones and the joints. And you have another theory about how you talk about the effect of collagen, the effect how glyphosate has on collagen, which will then affect the bones and the joints. So why don't you fill us in on that?
Well, so collagen is is probably the protein in the body that has more glycine than any other protein relative to the other amino acids. It's extremely high levels of glycine in collagen. That's also true glyphosate. But collagen has long swaths of GXY, 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 where there's a glycine and then two other amino acids that could be anything, and then another glycine. Every third one is a glycine in a pattern in collagen. And there have been lots and lots of cases where people have had mutations in the glycines in collagen where they get disease. And for example, and I just wrote this down here, osteogenesis imperfecta, which I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's the brittle bone disease. And this is, of course, when kids with brittle bones, their bones break very quickly, and you end up with parents getting accused of, abusing their child because the bones broke, because the bones are very sensitive to being broken. If you have this condition, which is caused by a huge number of mutations, a number of different mutations in glycine, in collagen, cause this disease. So if you think about glyphosate substituting for glycine in collagen, it's going to imitate these diseases that have these genetic mutations. It's going to have the same effect when it puts glyphosate there as if it had been mutated into a different amino acid, the glycine. And so there's also, of course, Ehlers-Danlos. I don't know if you've heard of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
No.
Because that's an interesting one. That's also many different glycine mutations in collagen are causing that. And that has a whole bunch of side effects, a lot of different features that show up as defects with that disease. And it's been rising in the population. It's now estimated in some cases to be as high as 2% of the population that actually have varying degrees of it. And it's increasing because glyphosate is messing up the collagen on top of whatever is going on with your genetics, just making anybody who has that disease more sensitive, that genetic mutation more sensitive to harm, because glyphosate's helping it out to make the collagen screwed up. So basically, when you substitute glyphosate for one of those glycines, the collagen has this beautiful triple helix that it forms, and that allows it it gives it its properties. It has really interesting properties in terms of tensile strength, and it absorbs water. It has its flexibility. I mean, the whole way collagen works depends upon that crystal structure that it forms, this beautiful triple helix structure. If you start sticking glyphosate atoms molecules at various spots in collagen, you're going to mess up that triple helix structure, and that's going to cause it not to retain water. It's going to cause joints to grind together and cause issues with various joint pain and having to have joint surgery. And that's another thing that's gone up incredibly dramatically. I had some statistics on men, for example. There were studies that showed that men have the increase in the number of men having hip surgery has gone up 26-fold in the last 30 years, 15-fold increase in knee surgery. Rotator cuff repair is much more common now than it used to be. All these different joint surgeries that we're seeing with the shoulders, the knees. And of course, back pain is also a huge problem these days. And that's also connected to the disruption of collagen, I suspect, by glyphosate, as well as the disruption of another protein called fibrillin, which also plays an important role. That one also, there's a disease called Marfan syndrome, which is connected to, and there's like 56 different glycine mutations that have been linked to Marfan syndrome, because fibrillin also has a lot of glycine, a lot of opportunities for glyphosate to substitute. And if it does substitute, it's going to cause disease. And so these are all, collagen, of course, in the skin and the bones and the joints.
Let's go to the
It's
bone.
really basic.
Let's go to the bones. So people, because this audience is a bone audience. So
yes.
The fact that and first of all, when did glyphosate actually come about? What was the exact year?
Yeah, it was introduced in the food chain in 1974. Okay. And it was used modestly because it killed the plants, so it was hard to use. Once they discovered the idea of the GMO, then it really took off. So really late 1990s, it started growing exponentially. And that's when we started to see an exponential growth in things like autism and Alzheimer's disease. And also diabetes and obesity, by the way, those are also going up exactly in step with glyphosate. And I think glyphosate is the cause of the epidemic that we're seeing in diabetes and obesity.
So let's go back. That's so many times people say, oh, well, my grandmother ate all that and she lived, but they didn't have this back then. Their food was very different in so many ways, but they didn't have glyphosate. It's interesting that with the advent of glyphosate, so many conditions have gone up. How sad is that? But my question is back to the bones. Okay, so now with the collagen, when it doesn't have the glycine because of the substitution, then what will happen? Like, what would you typically see in the bone?
Well, that's a brittle bone, for example. This brittle bone disease has to do with collagen. Glycine mutations in collagen causes this brittle bone syndrome, which is your bones are very brittle and fragile and they break very easily. And so I would imagine glyphosate substituting for collagen would have the same effect. Also, there's the chondroitin sulfate. The bones depend critically on chondroitin sulfate, and people take chondroitin supplements to help with their bone quality of their bones. And chondroitin sulfate depends on vitamin D, and vitamin D gets killed by glyphosate. So we have an absolute epidemic in vitamin D deficiency. And that's because for one reason is that it can't be activated in the liver because of the cytochrome P450 enzyme disruption. I think vitamin D is also, vitamin D synthesis in the skin is also affected. The melanin deficiency due to melanin coming out of the shikimate pathway. A lot of people say they go out in the sun, they burn, they can't tan, they have to wear a lot of sunscreen. Sunscreen prevents you from making vitamin D. So we're sort of, the glyphosate, I think, makes the skin more susceptible to sun damage, which inspires people to use more sunscreen, which causes them to not get enough vitamin D.
Wow. So Dr. Seneff, okay, we see how beyond horrific this glyphosate is. I don't think there's anyone listening that is thinking, oh my gosh, this is just horrible. And so what can we do? You gave us number one. Let's just go through solutions, because it is, and the sad thing, I believe, I agree with you. I think it is as bad, and I think it's just, I just think it's horrible that you know, as a country, we're not doing anything. But let's just go through what people who are listening can do, because there are things we can do. So number one, you talked about the organic. So what else can we do?
Yeah, absolutely essential to eat organic. Now, we didn't talk a lot about sulfur, but I've done a lot of research on sulfur. And I believe glyphosate is an absolute train wreck for sulfur in so many dimensions. It really messes up the whole sulfur system. And sulfur is absolutely essential for life. So it messes up, for example, the ability to make sulfate. It disrupts the ability to transport sulfate, and it disrupts the ability to transfer sulfate from one molecule to another. This means that we have a tremendous deficiency in sulfate as a consequence of glyphosate exposure. So a lot of people are sensitive to sulfur-containing foods, and that's also probably due to glyphosate, because it disrupts sulfite oxidase, which is an enzyme that converts sulfite to sulfate. If that enzyme's broken, sulfite builds up and sulfate becomes deficient. Sulfite is extremely reactive and very toxic. Usually you want to get rid of it really fast, and you have enzymes to do that, but they get broken by glyphosate. So you become sensitive, you get hydrogen sulfide gas, you get a lot of issues with sulfur.
And why, what, can you just tell everyone about the sulfate, why that is so important in the body, what functions that's
it plays a lot of functions, but perhaps the most important one is the creation of structured water. So it creates what's called easy water, exclusion zone water, that surrounds, for example, lines all of the blood vessels. And the exclusion zone water is essential for maintaining the electrical system of the body through mechanisms that are quite complicated. And
we don't have to go into that. Okay, but just so people.
Jerry Pollack is the name. You want to look for Jerry Pollack. He has a couple of wonderful books, Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, and the fourth phase of water. He talks about this fourth phase being gelled water. Sulfate maintains the gelled water, and it's critical to keep the water gelled in most of the body except where the blood is circulating. So you have to make sure the blood can circulate. So you can't just throw free sulfate into the blood at high levels, because you'll gel the blood. So the body has developed very sophisticated mechanisms for controlling, for synthesizing, transporting, and delivering sulfate. It really, I think, obsesses on making sure there's enough sulfate, especially, for example, in the brain. Heparan sulfate deficiency in the brain is very strongly linked to autism. So, and I mentioned chondroitin sulfate. I mean, these are chondroitin sulfate in the bones is really important in the bones. And that's another role for sulfate. So sulfate is an overlooked molecule. We don't hear a lot about it. And we sort of almost think of it as like a waste product. It just gets shipped out through the urine, but that is not true at all. It is very, very important in the body, and it's tricky to deal with. And glyphosate is basically a train wreck for sulfate. So I say eat lots of sulfur-containing foods. Stay away from glyphosate. Eat lots of sulfur-containing foods. I believe in eating a high-fat diet, low carb, and certainly low processed foods. Get rid of, if you can, get rid of all the processed foods. Don't buy anything that's in a box or, you know, with a bunch of ingredients, a bunch of chemical looking ingredients. Don't buy it, you know. So avoid the processed foods. Eat foods you recognize, you know, a lot of cruciferous vegetables. We eat tons of those. Those are good for a good source of sulfur, and also for vitamin C. Vitamin C is another important thing to get enough of for the bones. And so eating, you know, healthy fruits, organic fruits, I actually believe in eating seafood and eggs. Organic eggs are really healthy food with lots of nutrition, and grass-fed beef, you know, so high quality meats are really good. And seafood is terrific because it has lots and lots of minerals. Like, we didn't get into the minerals, but glyphosate also messes up the minerals.
Well, let's talk about that, though. That's important for the bones.
Manganese, for example, right?
Yeah. And I heard that, how glyphosate affects manganese. I'm thinking, oh, that's so important for our bones. So
Yeah, and also iron. I mean, it causes iron and manganese to be simultaneously toxic and deficient because it disrupts the body's natural ways of managing those. Minerals are very important catalysts for various enzymatic reactions. We need them essentially in trace amounts, but they're generally also, because they're reactive, because they can make reactions happen faster, they're also toxic. So the body has learned how to package them up, and transport them and whatnot. For example, hemoglobin, which is in the red blood cells, carries iron. It carries iron. It's a way of transporting iron, and the heme synthesis is disrupted by glyphosate. So we end up not being able to easily transport the iron, and the free iron becomes toxic in the blood, and that causes some nasty reactions that can damage tissues. So and manganese is the same thing. Manganese piles up in the liver because the bile acids, the body depends on the bile acids to ship the manganese back to the gut, and then it gets distributed to the body, probably through the chylomicron, which is the way the body transports fat. So the chylomicron carries the manganese out to the bloodstream, and then it gets circulated to all the organs. But that whole thing gets blocked by glyphosate because the bile acids are not being produced in sufficient amounts. The manganese ends up piling up in the liver, and it can become toxic if it's too high. The liver ships it out along the nerve fibers, the vagus nerve. It ships the manganese along the vagus nerve up to the brainstem, and then it becomes too concentrated in the brainstem, which causes things like ADHD and Parkinson's disease. So it's a real mess with manganese. We end up being both deficient and toxic at the same time.
and what would you
Because
typically
glyphosate's
see?
disrupted.
What would you would see low iron in blood?
Yeah.
And would you
Well, no, you see the iron might be there, but it's not in the right form. Like, it's just free iron in the blood is very dangerous, whereas you need to have iron carriers. The molecules that are intended to carry the iron get disrupted by glyphosate. And also glyphosate binds to the iron. So it binds to both manganese and iron very, very aggressively, but it'll drop it off once it gets into an acidic environment. So when it gets into the brainstem, that the pH goes down, and so the glyphosate will unload these minerals that it's been transporting. It'll unload them in inappropriate places and cause toxicity. So
wow.
it's both toxic and deficient. It really messes up the minerals. Again, the body has developed really elegant systems for dealing with these things, but glyphosate just throws a monkey wrench into the whole system.
So you talked about the diet. Now, what about, are there any ways we can naturally detox, or is there anything, supplement, anything that could help us with this glyphosate issue?
Yeah, there are people who are marketing products that I think might be, I think the jury's still out, but people are finding, I think, that they seem to be beneficial. There's Biomedic is one that I'm familiar with, and also Restore for Life, Restore. Both of those are being marketed as being able to help to detox glyphosate. And they basically, one of the things they're based on is spore bacteria. So the spores are important because it can get past the stomach, which can kill bacteria. And then the spores can be released in the lower gut and can help to replenish. So probiotics in general are probably beneficial. You really need to straighten up your gut. That's the absolutely most important thing to do. So probiotics can help you do that. There are also some microbes that can fully metabolize glyphosate. And so Acetobacter is one of those. And so I'm hoping that it's the case, and I've been saying this, that apple cider vinegar. So I like to take Bragg's organic apple cider vinegar on a regular basis.
Me too.
Oh, great. So I think there's no downside to that. And it may be that those microbes can metabolize glyphosate, completely clear it and turn it into useful products. So that's really, really great. Metabolizing it is the very best you could do. There are also ways to break it down non-enzymatically. And luckily, there's what's used in water purification. They use in water purification plants for the water system, the water supply. They use ozone and chlorine. And both of them have been shown to be able to break glyphosate down non-enzymatically, which is really fortunate, because I think that's why we haven't been hit as hard as we would have been by glyphosate in our water supply, because of those things that they naturally do in the water purification plants. It's helping to clear the glyphosate from the water supply.
In terms of probiotics, what about probiotic food? The fermented food, the sauerkrauts, or would you recommend people?
Absolutely. And in fact, there was even a study on cows where they had cows that were sick. They measured glyphosate, found high levels in their urine, and they treated them with sauerkraut juice. And I don't know how they knew to do that, but they used sauerkraut juice And they use fulvic acid and humic acid, which are organic matter from the soil. Those are known to bind chemicals and help to push them out through the feces. So fulvic acid, humic acid, sauerkraut juice, and bentonite clay. So they used those as treatment, and they found after the treatment that the glyphosate level in the urine went down and the cow's health improved. So that was really a nice paper to kind of point the way for some ideas for humans. These are all things we can take.
You know, it's interesting because there's someone had told me about a doctor who actually uses fulvic acid for osteoporosis and has gotten really great results. And it's something that I was thinking of, you know, having him come on the podcast, because it's not something that's typical in the treatment, but that's so interesting that you mentioned fulvic acid.
So it might be doing it through removing the glyphosate, because I think a lot of the things that are turning out to be beneficial, that one of their key mechanisms of benefit is depleting, is getting rid of glyphosate.
And we're not tested for glyphosate though.
Not usually. I mean, it's possible to test for glyphosate. There are labs that will do it. Something like $100.
Is it something that you've worked with any of the physicians are doing that, testing for glyphosate?
I work with a woman who has a website where you can order tests for glyphosate. She's a nurse practitioner.
Oh, that's
and she says they're finding glyphosate in just about everybody who's tested.
Are there certain levels where you know it's?
Yeah, there's a range. So you can get a test that shows, and then you'll get back. It's I've forgotten the name of the lab. That's a senior moment here.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, she sends it off to a lab where they do the tests, and they're getting, and then they have a range. They have a range of what they're seeing in the people that they're testing, and then you can see where you sit on that scale. Because we don't really know what's right is 0, but we don't know what's okay and what's not okay. But you can at least reference yourself to other people to see.
Right. Well, the good thing though is what the treatment is good for everything.
Exactly.
Right?
And the treatments are not harmful. These are really very innocent things. So it's luckily the case that
who wouldn't be? I always have at least a forkful of, and the sauerkraut's not just the regular sauerkraut for everybody listening. It's not just going, this is the sauerkraut that's fermented. So it's in the refrigerator section of the health food store or Whole Foods. It's something, it's not just getting, the sauerkraut from your hot dog.
Right. And organic, of course. Right?
Yes,
so organic, fermented, refrigerated sauerkraut. Absolutely.
So that's great that they did that study. That's very interesting. So
yes.
I think, especially with all the work you're doing, I think things are going to just continue to, so that this can be something and we can deal with it and really prevent all these terrible, terrible side effects. Just get rid of this chemical. I mean,
it's hard for people to know. It's hard for people to realize, I think, and they've heard for so long that it's safe, and they know that it's so pervasive, and so it's sort of a level of disbelief. I mean, some people just say it can't be true. I mean, it's sort of like the EMFs, right? There are people who are crying out about the EMFs, 5G and how dangerous it is. I don't know if you're aware of that, but there are scientists who are very, very concerned about 5G. And then most of the people are like, well, it's been around. It's sort of like EMFs have been around and I'm still alive. And same thing with glyphosate, right? How could it be that this one chemical could be causing all these problems? It's sort of a level of disbelief that people have. And also because it's slow and insidious, it doesn't hit you over the head, so you don't realize you're being poisoned.
I know the scary thing is, this generation now, it's just that we don't know what's going to happen in 20 years when everyone's been exposed to so many things. That's why I think it's important that people are aware and not just say, oh, I'll deal with it later. Well, nobody wants Alzheimer's. Nobody wants all of these terrible things that can happen. And, we want our bones to be strong. So I just think, a lot of the things that you said are easy to do, at least the basic. And
then I would say also, of course, getting out in the sunlight. I think that's really, really important, to get out in the sunlight without sunscreen, even without sunglasses. I really obsess on getting enough sunlight exposure. I believe the sun is very healing and certainly very important for the bones, sunlight exposure. And I think it's more than vitamin D, because I believe the sunlight actually catalyzes the synthesis of sulfate in the skin. And sulfate is so important for the bones, and the chondroitin sulfate. And so, and I think that people who get a lot of sun tend to have really healthy bones, and people who don't tend to get osteoporosis. I really believe in sunlight as a treatment, to maintain healthy bones. And then also Epsom salt baths is another thing I recommend, which is a way to get sulfate. Epsom salts are magnesium sulfate. And so you can just throw some of those into the bath water, have a very hot bath, try to make it as hot as you can stand, because that will help to produce infrared heat, which actually grows this exclusion zone water and helps to make the whole thing work well. So very hot bath soaking with Epsom salts thrown into the bath water.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that too. I love Epsom salts, and that's a great way for people also to get their magnesium. And then I like to throw a little lavender in there, relax, because relaxation reduces cortisol. So it's just such a win-win situation. But that's interesting. I never heard to make it as hot as you possibly can. That's interesting.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
And of course, sulfur hot springs would be perfect, and if you live near them, natural sulfur hot springs. When I get a chance, I do that. If I'm in a place where they have them, I like to go to the sulfur hot springs.
You know, it's funny because, and that water, the water from the hot springs as well. I was in Japan and they were boasting about this area that the hot springs are so great. And I'm thinking, oh, we'll try it. And in the hotel, then they had a pool with this water. And it was so amazing. I've never felt anything like it. That I went back after dinner, we hung out in the bathtub because water was just miraculous. It was just so fabulous. So that's a great tip. Oh my gosh, we could. Is there anything else you want to enlighten us?
We've covered a lot.
Oh my gosh, we've talked for hours. We could talk for so much because you are just such a wealth of knowledge. And I, as I said, I can't thank you enough for all the hard work you've done and the research and how you've changed your scope of work so that you could bring this to the public and really make a difference. And I think I know you are, and I think it's only going to continue. And I think the world's changing, and it's from people listening and saying, you know what, I don't want that glyphosate. And I think that only, it's going to keep, good things are going to keep happening. And I think your work and the fact you're writing a book, that's wonderful. So great for you. And thank you so much. And I'll have your website. Is that the best place for people if they want to follow you?
And if they can remember my last name, it's fairly rare. So if you search Seneff, you'll find a lot of stuff, various podcasts and webcasts and slideshows.
And your articles, you've written so many articles on glyphosate and so many different conditions that it's just, it's really a tremendous amount of information. So
and you can find I pretty much have posted all of my glyphosate articles directly on my webpage, so you can download them there if you want to actually get into the nitty-gritty science of glyphosate, which is quite amazing. I'm finding it very entertaining and absorbing. So it seems like it's going to be a lifetime. And very upsetting. I mean, we have to ban it worldwide. I won't rest until it's banned worldwide. It needs to be completely off the market and all the factories have to be shut down.
Yeah.
We need to do that immediately. I mean, I really think if we want a future, because it's also disrupting our ability to reproduce.
And in Europe, it's not nearly what it is here, correct?
Yeah, it's much less of a problem in Europe. We're sort of number one. Canada and the US, I think, are pretty much in a race for number one on glyphosate usage.
Not something we want to win. Definitely not something we want to be number one. But we'll keep everybody informed, and I'll keep up on all your things so that if there are things that people need to do or support, that we can be there, because this is a serious situation that we want to remedy for sure. So thank you again. This has been, I've learned so much, and I just thank you for all the work you do, and you're just making a big difference for our bones, for our health, just for the planet and the whole world. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And it's been a pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed today's interview with Dr. Seneff as much as I have, and I've learned some new information about glyphosate and how it may be impacting your health. And the good news is Dr. Seneff gave us some great action steps that we can easily put into our life. So bye for now, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Happy Bones, Happy Life podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe on your favorite listening app so that you don't miss any amazing insights on upcoming episodes. And until next time, continue to live your best life ever. See you soon.